Sophie Cunningham didn't just get fined by the WNBA. She turned those fines into a full-blown PR firestorm that made her bigger than the league's own marketing campaigns. One TikTok mocking referees cost her $500. Talking about that fine on her podcast, another $1,500. And instead of backing down, Sophie doubled down, turning the league's attempt to shut her up into the best brand-building moment of her career. Here's the thing about Sophie. If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. She's not exactly the type to quietly nod, smile, and take her punishment. This is a player who understands the internet, who knows that in the age of viral outrage, the worst thing you can do is be boring. So when the WNBA tried to make an example out of her, she flipped the script. What was supposed to be a slap on the wrist became the opening scene in a story about how one player outsmarted an entire league. The whole thing started with a TikTok, just Sophie being Sophie. No big production, no PR polish, just a cheeky, exaggerated impression of referees, missing calls. The kind of content fans love because it's honest and relatable. You've been in a game, you've seen refs make questionable calls, and you've definitely seen athletes bite their tongues on camera. Sophie? She skipped the biting her tongue part. It was playful, but it hit a nerve in the WNBA offices. Next thing you know, there's a fine, $500 for public criticism of officiating. Now, in the grand scheme of pro sports salaries, $500 isn't exactly life-changing money, but it was a principle of it. Fans were outraged, not at Sophie, but at the league, because instead of laughing it off, or better yet, embracing her humor as a way to make the game more accessible, the WNBA went full corporate killjoy mode. And that's when Sophie made her first power move. She talked about the fine on her podcast, Show Me Something, not in a groveling, apologetic way, but in a can you believe this way. She told her audience exactly what happened, laughing about it, throwing in some sass, and basically inviting everyone to join the inside joke. The WNBA did not find it funny. They doubled the penalty, this time hitting her with a $1,500 fine for continuing to publicly discuss officiating, which, if you think about it, was basically the league writing her a blank check for more content. Sophie even joked that at this rate, she'd have to start a GoFundMe just for speaking fees. And the fans? Oh, they ate it up. Social media lit up with people offering to pay her fines themselves. Some even called it a free speech tax. The viral momentum was unstoppable. Sophie had gone from just another player with a podcast to the league's most talked about personality, literally because the WNBA tried to silence her. The irony here is almost cinematic. The WNBA, which has been trying for years to grow its audience and connect with younger fans, managed to stumble into the perfect viral marketing moment and then stomp all over it. Sophie's TikTok could have been reposted on the league's own channels with a wink and a caption. Instead, they turned it into a public drama, which only made her more iconic. Her podcast numbers exploded. People who had never listened to Show Me Something before were now binge listening to old episodes just to see what else she had to say. Brands took notice, too, because nothing says marketable like being the face of a David versus Goliath moment in sports. Suddenly, Sophie wasn't just an athlete. She was an influencer, a cultural personality, and a walking case study in how authenticity beats corporate control every time. This is where you can almost hear the WNBA's PR department sighing into their coffee. They had a player who was naturally charismatic, who could have been a bridge between the league and the fans, and instead they positioned her as a rebellious outsider. And let's be honest, fans love a rebel way more than they love a press release. But Sophie's rise also exposed something deeper, something that's been simmering under the surface of the league for a while. The double standard when it comes to professionalism. Players are fined for speaking their minds about officiating, but when it comes to actual player safety, when questionable fouls or injuries happen on the court, those same rules suddenly feel a lot more flexible. The message it sends? Be quiet, be polished, don't rock the boat. And that's exactly why Sophie's story resonated so much. She wasn't just making a joke about refs. She was pushing back against the unspoken rule that players should be seen, not heard, unless they're delivering carefully approved talking points. Her TikTok was a spark, but the real fire came from fans recognizing that she was saying what so many others were thinking. It also didn't hurt that Sophie has that rare mix of confidence and approachability. She's competitive, yes, but she's also the kind of personality who can make you feel like you're just hanging out in her living room while she spills tea about the league. That authenticity is gold in the influencer world, and she's savvy enough to know it. By the time the second fine rolled in, Sophie wasn't scrambling to save face. She was leaning into the narrative, posting, joking, turning every new twist into content. And the more the league tried to pull her back, the more the audience leaned in. It was a masterclass in what marketers call the Streisand effect. Try to hide something and you'll only make more people want to see it. The funniest part? Sophie's brand probably got more value out of those fines than any official WNBA campaign has done for a player in months. The coverage wasn't just in sports media. It crossed over into mainstream pop culture conversations, influencer commentary, even marketing think pieces. She became the league's most marketable rebel, without even trying to be. And in the process, she proved something the WNBA might not want to hear. Players don't need the league's permission to build their own platforms. In fact, sometimes pushing back against the league is the fastest way to do it. The takeaway here isn't that Sophie Cunningham is some kind of villain, or that the WNBA is a big bad wolf. It's that in the age of social media, personality and authenticity will always beat corporate control. Sophie didn't just survive the fines. She turned them into rocket fuel. She's now bigger than the controversy that started it all, and the WNBA? They're left with the awkward realization that they helped make it happen. And you have to wonder, what happens the next time a player decides to speak up? Will the league finally recognize the value in letting personalities shine? Or will they keep doubling down on fines and hoping players fall in line? If history is anything to go by, Sophie's story will be the blueprint for how to flip the script. Because in the end, Sophie Cunningham didn't just mock the refs. She called out an entire system without even breaking a sweat. And the best part? She got paid in followers, sponsorships, and cultural clout for doing it. Now the league has a choice. Keep trying to tame her, or realize they've got a star who knows how to work the game both on and off the court. Either way, Sophie's not going back to being just another player on a roster. She's built something bigger, something that can't be fined away. And that's the real plot twist. Sophie Cunningham didn't lose to the WNBA's rulebook. She rewrote it. After the second fine hit, that $1,500, don't talk about the first fine penalty. Sophie basically became the unofficial mayor of Pettyville population. She didn't just accept the punishment. She leaned into it so hard it became part of her public persona. She started casually referencing the fines in interviews, dropping sly comments in her Instagram captions, and turning podcast episodes into wink-wink moments where everyone knew the subtext, but she never gave the league anything quotable enough to hit her again, at least not right away. Her audience was now on high alert. Every time she posted, fans were half waiting for the next shot at the league. The podcast Show Me Something wasn't just sports commentary anymore. It was appointment listening. The first episodes after the controversy doubled in downloads, then tripled. Sponsors noticed a surge. Suddenly, companies that had never even considered working with a mid-market WNBA player were reaching out. And here's where Sophie proved she wasn't just stumbling into this. She knew how to play the long game. Instead of selling out her personality to fit a brand, she partnered with companies that got the vibe. The first sponsorships were cheeky, leaning into her reputation as a fine magnet. There were T-shirts reading, "Worth every penny," coffee mugs with $1 500 sip printed on them. Limited drops sold out in hours. The fans weren't just watching Sophie's rise. They were actively funding it. Meanwhile, the WNBA was in this weird bind. The fines were technically enforceable, but now they were the centerpiece of a cultural moment. To punish her again risked looking like a personal vendetta. To ignore her was to admit they'd lost control of the narrative. And in sports, when you lose control of the narrative, you lose the power to set the tone. Sophie didn't just beat the fines. She reframed them. Instead of breaking the rules, she made it feel like breaking the silence. That's a subtle shift, but it's the kind of thing fans latch on to. In the minds of her audience, Sophie wasn't just talking about refs. She was poking the bigger issue of whether players are allowed to be fully themselves in the league they represent. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Authenticity is dangerous for organizations built on tightly managed PR. The WNBA wants players to be marketable, sure, but marketable on the league's terms. Sophie's whole brand now was marketable on Sophie's terms. And because she was delivering bigger fan engagement numbers than players who stayed inside the lines, the old rulebook started to look outdated. It's not like Sophie was the first athlete to push back on league control, but she did it in a way that was accessible. She wasn't launching a scorched earth campaign or giving bitter press conferences. She was laughing, joking, posting relatable TikToks, and making the audience feel like they were in on the fun. It's the difference between yelling at the system and trolling it so effectively that everyone laughs, except the people in charge. Then came the fan-funded fines. After the second penalty, supporters started pooling money, saying, "We'll pay it for her." It wasn't about whether she could afford it. It was about sending a message that fans had her back. That made the WNBA look even more out of touch. Because now the optics weren't player gets fined. They were league finds a fan favorite and fans bail her out. It was priceless marketing for Sophie and a slow-motion PR headache for the league. By mid-season, Sophie had accidentally built one of the most recognizable personal brands in women's basketball. Her social media following had spiked. Her podcast was in heavy rotation, and her name recognition outside the sport had exploded. If you were even casually following sports news, you knew who she was. That's when the Sophie effect started creeping into conversations. Other players were watching her trajectory. They saw her parlaying a punishment into sponsorships, audience growth, and cultural relevance. And it wasn't lost on them that the WNBA, for all its marketing muscle, hadn't managed to give them the same platform. It's here that the league's double standard really came under the microscope. Fans and commentators started pointing out how quickly the WNBA had moved to penalize Sophie for criticizing officiating, and how slowly they moved when it came to addressing officiating mistakes themselves, or more serious player welfare issues. In other words, where's the accountability on the other side? Sophie, for her part, didn't have to hammer that point home directly. She just kept being herself, letting the fans and media connect the dots. It's a smart move. She kept her tone playful while the conversation around her got more serious. That way, she avoided looking bitter or combative, but the core message still landed. Her, rebel with a sense of humor, vibe worked. Think about it. You've got a league with a reputation for being buttoned up, and then you've got Sophie cracking jokes, calling things as she sees them, and still performing on the court. That contrast made her stand out even more. And this is where we have to talk about the Streisand effect again. The league's own actions turned a relatively minor TikTok into a league-wide talking point. If they'd laughed it off, Sophie's video might have been a 48-hour blip in the news cycle. Instead, it became the foundation of her empire. One sports columnist even joked that the WNBA had done more for Sophie's career in those 2 fines than in her entire tenure with the league. Harsh, but not entirely wrong. Because here's the unfiltered reality. Sophie's brand now operates independently of the WNBA spotlight. She doesn't need league approval to pull in listeners, followers, or sponsors. That independence is powerful. In sports, leagues typically want to be the gatekeepers for player exposure. But Sophie's story is proof that in 2025, you can bypass the gate entirely if you know how to work your audience. By late summer, she was being invited onto mainstream talk shows and sports panels to discuss athlete expression. Which is funny, because a year earlier, the league probably wouldn't have considered her a spokesperson for anything outside her own team. Now, she was a case study in every authenticity and marketing seminar across the country. The fallout for the WNBA's image wasn't catastrophic. They weathered PR bumps before, but it did force a subtle shift in tone. By the end of the season, league communications felt a little looser, a little more self-aware. And you could trace that shift right back to Sophie. Because whether the league wants to admit it or not, she proved a point. You can't find away personality. You can't control every narrative in an era where athletes have direct channels to their audience. And if you try too hard to suppress that, you might just create the very thing you're trying to avoid, a bigger, louder, unstoppable version of the player you were trying to quiet. And Sophie? She's still out here thriving, still podcasting, still building partnerships, still pulling in an audience that's bigger than the league's own digital channels in some weeks. The fines are a punchline now, a badge of honor she wears with a smirk. When Sophie turned those fines into viral fuel, she didn't just blow up her own platform. She unintentionally became the topic of whispered conversations all over the league. Players were watching closely. Some were inspired, some were curious, and some were straight up taking notes. Here's why. The WNBA has always operated on this tightrope between promoting individuality and maintaining league image. They'll celebrate player personalities when it fits into a neat campaign or media day soundbite. But the second it veers into something they can't control, out comes the rulebook. Sophie didn't just step off the tightrope. She cartwheeled into the stands and handed out microphones. In locker rooms across the league, teammates from different franchises started sharing her clips, laughing over the podcast moments, and joking about what they wish they could say without getting fined. And you could feel this slow build of not rebellion exactly, but restlessness. Because Sophie was living proof that you could take a fine, flip it into content, and actually come out ahead. Meanwhile, executives and PR teams were having the opposite conversation. How do you keep this from becoming a trend? If more players start speaking freely, especially in ways that critique officiating or league operations, then the WNBA risks losing its carefully curated image. To them, Sophie wasn't just a player. She was a proof of concept for an uncontrollable narrative. The irony? Every meeting about how to contain this was happening while Sophie's audience kept growing. By this point, Show Me Something wasn't just sports talk. She was booking crossover guests from music, comedy, and even former players who had their own stories about bumping heads with the league. The podcast became a kind of casual clubhouse for athlete honesty, and fans couldn't get enough. Sponsors loved it too, because brands crave authenticity. And let's be honest, nothing feels more authentic than someone laughing in the face of authority, especially when that authority looks humorless. Sophie wasn't out here screaming, "Fight the power." She was just rolling her eyes in public, and that somehow felt even more relatable. Then came the merch boom. At first, it was just small runs of worth every penny shirts, but fans kept demanding more. Before long, Sophie's team had quietly built a mini brand. Hoodies, hats, mugs, stickers. They didn't even have to do heavy marketing. Social media did it for them. Every time someone wore one to a game, it was like planting a little flag that said, "We're with her." The WNBA didn't officially acknowledge the merch, but you can bet they noticed. Every Fine Club hoodie in the crowd was a reminder that their punishment had turned into a fan identity. And while this was happening, something else started to shift. Sophie's role in the larger conversation about player autonomy. Suddenly, sports talk shows that barely covered the WNBA before were bringing her on as a guest. She wasn't just Sophie Cunningham, athlete, anymore. She was Sophie Cunningham, the player who stood up to the league and won the internet. That's a way bigger title in the modern sports world. Here's the thing. Athletes today don't just exist in one lane anymore. They're brands, they're media personalities, they're entrepreneurs. Sophie proved she could be all three without waiting for the WNBA to hand her the spotlight. That kind of independence is rare, and it makes leagues nervous because it means they're not the gatekeepers anymore. By late in the season, the situation had settled into this uneasy stalemate. The league stopped publicly escalating the fines, and Sophie stopped directly daring them to. But the energy never died. Every new episode of her podcast felt like it might contain a sly jab. Every post-game interview carried the possibility of another viral quote. From a business perspective, Sophie's value was now doubled, both as a player and as a content creator with a loyal, engaged following. Brands weren't just sponsoring her for game day visibility anymore. They wanted her personality, her humor, her ability to connect with fans who might not even watch basketball regularly. And that's where the real long-term shift happened. Other players started realizing they could carve their own media spaces too. Maybe not everyone would go as far as Sophie in pushing league boundaries, but the blueprint was there. Be real, be consistent, and use every controversy as an opportunity to deepen your relationship with your audience. Even the most cautious players were curious. Could they talk more freely on their socials? Could they host their own podcasts without getting tangled in league approvals? Sophie's fines had started a quiet dialogue about where the line actually was and how much power players really had to cross it. Now, let's talk about the WNBA's perspective for a second, because it's not all cartoon villainy. From their point of view, managing a growing league means protecting the product. They don't want officiating controversies overshadowing the games themselves. But where they miscalculated was in underestimating how fans consume sports today. Fans don't just want a final score anymore. They want the story, the drama, the personalities. Sophie gave them all three in one package. And when the league tried to cut out one piece, the criticism, they accidentally made the other two shine brighter. Here's where the cultural gap really shows. In the league office, a $500 fine is a disciplinary measure. On the internet, a $500 fine is content. And content, especially spicy content, travels farther than any official highlight reel. By the off-season, Sophie was fielding offers to collaborate with media networks, appear at events, and even develop spin-off content under her own production umbrella. The fines had become lore, the origin story of a player who wasn't afraid to talk back. The WNBA had a choice: adapt or risk more Sophie-style uprisings. If they tried to clamp down harder, they looked like they were policing personality. If they loosened up, they'd risk more players testing the limits. It was a PR puzzle with no perfect answer. And Sophie, she didn't have to choose. She'd already built something sustainable. Even if the league suddenly decided to ghost her, she had her own channels, her own sponsors, her own audience. She was playing two games now, one on the court and one in the attention economy. In a way, that's what makes this story so satisfying. Sophie never stopped being an athlete, but she also never let the athlete role box her in. She showed that you could respect the game and still poke fun at the system running it. And now, her legacy isn't just going to be about stats or championships. It's going to be about how she turned a supposedly bad moment into a career-defining one. If you strip this whole saga down to its core, it's about control versus connection. The league wanted control. Sophie wanted connection with her fans, with the broader sports audience, with anyone who's ever rolled their eyes at authority. And in the social media era, connection usually wins. Even if you've never watched a WNBA game in your life, you can understand the appeal. Someone gets fined for saying what everyone else is thinking, laughs about it publicly, and somehow ends up richer and more famous for it. It's almost too perfect.